Welcome everyone to a virtual University of Strathclyde on behalf of our Principal and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Sir Jim MacDonald. Welcome to this 15th anniversary of the renewal of Scotland's partnership with Malawi, and to our guest lecture to mark the occasion by the Right Honourable Lord McConnell of Glenscorodale. We are of course delighted to welcome Lord McConnell to Strathclyde. As we all know, he played a critical role in 2005 as the primary architect in the reinvigoration of the partnership between our two nations. And I'll say more of this and properly introduce Jack soon. And a special welcome too to His Excellency Kenneth Ponda, Malawi High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. A particular welcome also to our guests from around the world, our friends in Malawi and our Strathclyde alumni and others from across the world. We are delighted to have you all with us today. Let me say straight away that any questions that you have can be put in the Q&A box, and we'll come to those later on this afternoon. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Andrew Gowdy. I'm the Special Advisor to the Principal here at Strathclyde and Co-Director of our new Centre for Sustainable Development. Perhaps most relevant to today, I was formerly Chief Economic Advisor and Director General in the Scottish Government, and worked with Jack throughout his time in the Scottish Parliament. The second slide just gives you a quick look at the format for this anniversary, which is very simple. First, I would like to offer some reflections for a short while on our gathering today. We'll then move on to the main event, and Jack will deliver the anniversary lecture. And finally, the Commissioner will offer some closing words for us. This event is about the totality of our relationship with Malawi. It is to mark, modestly, we should stress, all the great work that was done by everyone in 2005 in so many ways to reinvigorate the relationship between our two countries. It is about all the relationships between Scotland and our Malawian partners, embracing all the key contributors in that year, the Scottish and Malawi governments, our newly formed national civil society network, the Scotland Malawi Partnership, and our wider Scottish and Malawian societies, all the great NGOs, school children, public bodies, faith groups, companies, to name but some. Of course, Scotland had had many long-standing and valuable relationships with Malawi for decades before 2005, and these formed a great foundation for that year. And so 2005 was very much a reinvigoration, a refocusing, a moment to inspire an intensification of our links and a much deeper sense of partnership. It provided a great opportunity to add momentum and visibility to this step change. And this anniversary is also about what has been carried forward and developed much further over the past 15 years by all these partnerships, and about the successes that have been secured. And of course, we mark this anniversary with very open eyes. Our primary goal has always been to support the Malawian people in what they themselves want to achieve and in what they themselves want to be. And we haven't always got that right. And we meet today recognizing where we have done well, and sometimes very well, but also aware of what we didn't do quite so well, and with a sensitivity to the immensity of the challenge that we still face. 2020 is a year of many 15th anniversaries for our Malawi-Scotland friendship. And let me start with some reflections on 2005 itself to remind ourselves. As I said, 2005 provided a great opportunity. It was a year in which many things came together to bring a clarity to our vision for partnering with the Malawian people and to inject momentum. My slide lists some of these key moments. The modern story in many ways starts here at the University of Strathclyde in the late 1990s, when in response to the challenge of the UN Millennium Development Goals, several very enlightened colleagues in partnership with Bell College launched the Malawi Millennium Project, the MMP. And in 2004, from the MMP, evolved our civil society network to promote our Malawian relationships, the Scotland Malawi Partnership, which was officially launched in April of that year. As you will see, 2005 was full of important milestones. In February, a very significant and largely unnoticed step was taken when the Scottish Parliament passed the Budget Scotland Act 2005, for the first time making provision for international relations and significantly development assistance. A small sum, but crucial to enable the First Minister and his administration to legitimately spend resources in support of development assistance and for Malawi in particular. This was quickly followed in March by the First Minister publishing Scotland's first international development strategy, with a particular focus on the relationship between Scotland and Malawi. And in May, the First Minister visited Malawi for the first time, laying the foundation for the start of a major commitment by the Scottish Parliament towards supporting the Malawi people, a commitment that of course continues so strongly today. July saw the convening of the G8 Gleneagles Summit, a huge event for Scotland, notably with Africa as the sole agenda item for one of the G8 working sessions. You will recall too that the G8 coincided with the immensely impressive Make Poverty History campaign. I doubt that many of us believe that the G8 summit fully lived up to their final declaration, but it was a significant moment nonetheless. November the 3rd, 2005 was in many ways the pinnacle of 2005, with the signing of the cooperation agreement between the governments of Scotland and Malawi, signed in Edinburgh by the First Minister of Scotland, Jack McConnell, and His Excellency Dr. Binguwa Mutharika, President of the Republic of Malawi, a hugely significant moment for both countries. Indeed, this first cooperation agreement formed the bedrock for the relationship for no less than 13 years before it was renewed in April 2018 as the Global Goals Partnership Agreement to reflect the new priorities of Malawi and to more explicitly and more appropriately embrace the commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and to each other. And 2005 was wrapped up in November by the Scottish Parliament hosting a major and highly successful conference for the Scotland Malawi Partnership to map in greater detail our future cooperation together. That's a really whirlwind summary that I've given you, and I've certainly omitted many important moments, but it reminds us of the huge effort that was made by so many people to take our relationship to a new level. And if you prefer visual memories, then the slide that's just appeared there, that's a few from my archives on my laptop as a reminder. I have a couple of overarching reflections from the past 15 years. Perhaps my most important reflection relates to the nature of the relationship between our countries. A relationship founded on close, mutually respectful, and mutually beneficial partnerships that evolved from the catalytic impact of events in 2005, and especially the cooperation agreement. Many partnerships have developed at central and local government level and involving different arms of the public sector, but many more have grown throughout civil society. Many of you in both Malawi and Scotland today are intimately involved in these. Indeed, this approach has been the basis for building a sustainability that has often eluded many multilateral organizations and many national development bodies. Many partnerships have grown organically and have flourished, often inspired by some dedicated leaders. Many have benefited from the very significant leadership and support of both the Scottish Government and its funding, of course, and the support of our civil society network, the SNP. Government funding may be relatively modest, and of course we would all wish it were greater, I'm sure. But thanks to the insight and vision of successive Scottish governments and the Parliament, it has played a crucial role in supporting projects and programmes in many diverse areas and in leveraging more financial support from other sources. And in conjunction with the Malawi government, the Scottish Government will always have a role in gently reminding us all that aligning with the wishes of the Malawian people is a critical element in our partnership, maybe the most critical. Similarly, the SNP, which has evolved so effectively from the enlightened vision of its creators in Strathclyde, again with the indispensable support of the Scottish Government, has grown to be widely recognised now for its exceptional expertise and success in catalysing and nurturing and promoting more and more effective relationships across civil society. The outstanding leadership of the SNP has delivered tremendous support and visible and tangible outcomes. We can see the evidence of this in the insightful work of our academic colleagues at the University of Edinburgh. They have done some great work in estimating the amazing growth in the awareness and participation of Scots in the range of partnerships that grew out of 2005. And with the birth of the SNP's sister organisation, MASP, the Malawi-based Catalyst for Partnership, we feel a step closer to a whole of society approach in both our countries to our Malawi-Scotland relationship. And of course, as you'll see from our own website, Strathclyde, with the strong support and commitment of the principal, continues itself to have many very productive relationships with our Malawian counterparts, actively applying the great knowledge here to real-time challenges in Malawi. The key point here is that all these flourishing relationships are focused on one paramount goal, namely enhancing the well-being and securing better lives and livelihoods for the Malawian people. And crucially, seeing that all our partnerships are equally a source of great learning for Scotland too. This last point is immensely important. These are partnerships of equals in the sense that despite the obvious differences in monetary and material wealth and in opportunity, there is much to be learned from each other. In 2005, the cooperation agreement acknowledged that neither nation has the monopoly of wisdom and insight. And indeed, as COVID-19 has shockingly demonstrated, even if we didn't realize it before, there are only developing countries in this world. So I finished this first reflection with the slide that's up there at the moment. These are the opening words of the cooperation agreement that Jack developed with the president during his visit to Malawi in 2005, and which formally launched the last 15 years of partnership. Words articulating the fundamental basis of partnership. From what's there, I would note in particular, this is a reciprocal partnership based upon sharing experiences and skills. This document outlines an agreement to cooperate. The guiding principles underlined in this agreement are all engagement will be consistent with current government policy priorities and recognise the benefits of learning and sharing with one another. My final reflection is very brief indeed, and more about the value to Scotland of what emerged from 2005, but not at all in a selfish sense, in fact, quite the opposite. It relates to the value of the Malawi relationship in the context of what was then a very young Scottish Parliament. As you know, when the Scottish Parliament was formed, some people were hostile to the concept of devolution and attempted to smear it as being just another local authority, narrowly based and inward looking. Fortunately, this misguided view was a minority view, but I think there is a more profound and important point here. It was, in my view, important for the new Parliament, and indeed the country as a whole at that time, to see its place in the world, to look outward and to promote Scotland's sense of global responsibility. And Jack's vision for Scotland with respect to international development in general, and Malawi in particular, and indeed his broader global vision, did exactly that. International development may be a small part of parliamentary life, but it remains hugely symbolic and very real. And it is greatly to the credit of subsequent administrations and to the Scottish Parliament as a whole that today there remains a strong all-party support for the strategy. But let me now formally introduce Lord MacDonald to present the anniversary lecture on Leave No One Behind, a roadmap to build back better. Lord McConnell barely needs an introduction at all. He is a very familiar figure, not least, I suspect, to all of you today. Primarily, he was, of course, First Minister of Scotland from 2001 to 2007. He was a member of the Scottish Parliament from 1999 to 2011, holding the posts of Scotland's Minister for Finance and Minister for Education, Europe and External Affairs during that period. And he was President of the Legislative Regions of Europe in 2004. He also served as the UK Special Representative for Peace Building from 2008 to 2010, when he was appointed to the House of Lords. He is currently co-chair of the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group on the UN Global Goals for Sustainable Development. He is Vice President of UNICEF UK, Chair of the McConnell International Foundation, Chancellor of the University of Stirling, Chair of the Sustainable Development Panel for Scottish and Southern Energy, and he is a global advisor to PwC and advised in the implementation of peace agreements, including those in the Philippines. And somehow he finds time too to serve as ambassador and patron for a number of development and children's charities. And that's just to name a few of his contributions still today. Jack, over to you. We look forward greatly to your lecture. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you to the University of Strathclyde Centre for Sustainable Development, the new centre, for hosting this special anniversary lecture today. 15 years that have seen many changes in Scotland, in Malawi, and of course across the world, but that have cemented a friendship between two countries that goes way beyond even the whole of the 20th century, right back into the 19th century, and one that we were privileged, I think, to be able to reinforce and refresh back in 2005. I did read the brochure of the new Centre for Sustainable Development in preparation for this lecture, and I was delighted not so much to read about the individual projects and pieces of research. All of these are interesting and making a meaningful contribution, but I was really taken by the tone of the university and the centre's approach to sustainable development. This is not another exercise in putting together a group of individual projects and theming them up in order to promote the university or to attract research grants. It seems to me that this is a strategic decision to put sustainable development, as it says in the brochure, at the heart of the university's strategic plan, and embedded right across teaching, research, the sharing of knowledge and partnerships with others in a way that I think will be truly meaningful for the University of Strathclyde, both now and in the future, but also really meaningful for those who work with the university, both inside Scotland and the UK and right across the world. I was also really impressed by the way in which the centre describes its mission to co-create solutions, to secure real-world impact in order to tackle the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And again, a focus on impact, a focus on the co-creation of solutions, I think indicates a particular style and approach that in many ways is totally at home with the way in which the Scotland Malawi Partnership has grown over these last 15 years. It's particularly appropriate to be, I was going to say, in the University of Strathclyde tonight. Well, perhaps virtually in the University of Strathclyde tonight, because of course Peter West, the then University Secretary, played such a critical role in those events of 2005. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. For those, and I'm sure there are some listening tonight who were not even alive in 1999, never mind around and involved. The election campaign to the first Scottish Parliament in 1999 focused quite rightly on the economy, on education, on health, on the laws that the new Parliament would pass in its devolved areas and the way that it would work. But there was a small band of candidates in that election standing for different parties who were determined to ensure that there were at least some debates in the margins of the election campaign on the subject of what could the new Parliament do for international cooperation and development. George Reid, for example, the presiding officer when I was First Minister, and I both took part in a couple of very interesting events with the churches, looking at what that role might be as the new Parliament started to emerge. And I think we were pleased in the early days. I was a minister. I immediately was never involved in the backbenches at that stage, but across both ministerial ranks and in the backbenches of different parties, we were pleased to see initial debates and commitments, for example, in education, to a global education policy in every school in Scotland, and a ministerial focus on the environment that perhaps had been lacking in the pre-devolution days. But the main international focus of the new government and the Parliament in Edinburgh was on engagement in Europe, where a lot of our legislation was originating, and of course in attracting investment into Scotland as the economic challenges of the late 1990s started to bite in terms of GDP growth and also unemployment. When I became First Minister in 2001, I was determined to maintain that international role for the new devolved government and Parliament, and we were out there promoting Scotland and updating the brand image of Scotland so that we could attract investment, promote trade, develop educational partnerships for our universities and colleges and others, and also back home, make sure that we did not become the sort of insular country that some had feared. But I was also conscious we had to go further on climate and on international development. If we were going to demand more for Scotland from the rest of the world, we had to be willing to give more and make a bigger contribution too. Now, this was going to be an important part of Scotland's new image in the post-devolution era, but also it was right in terms of justice, for climate justice and for, of course, justice for those poorest parts of the world which were partly in that condition because of the way in which they had been treated back in those days of the UK, including Scotland, as a colonial power. So after 2003, when I had the good fortune to become First Minister into a second term, I was determined that we would set out a policy and we would make that policy as meaningful as possible. We didn't want to just duplicate the work of the Department for International Development. So we looked at what we could do that was different, that would add value. And it became quite clear that one of the ways in which Scotland could develop an international policy was to have systems of mutual cooperation that had a benefit not only to those elsewhere in the world who needed to build the capacity of their education or health or other systems, but also would be a direct benefit to Scots in terms of their perspective and understanding of the world in which they were operating. Supported by a certain economic advisor, Mr. Andrew Gowdy, to find that the Scotland Act contained a provision that we could support the work of the UK government if in certain areas which were not devolved. We did discover that we could have an international development budget. We were strongly supported by the then Secretary of State for International Development, Hilary Benn, who said in response to hostile questions from Scottish reporters and even from some Scottish elected members, that when it came to tackling extreme poverty around the world, there was more than enough work to go round, and he welcomed Scotland's input. Having decided that we would build an international development policy on mutual respect and mutual cooperation, we then looked at focusing that primarily, not solely, but primarily on one country. And it became clear very quickly that Malawi should be that choice. Not just because Malawi is a fantastic place, not just because it's the warm heart of Africa and anybody who has visited Malawi immediately falls in love, but because the connections between Scotland and Malawi went back so far, but also went so deep. The connections between the church in Scotland and the church in Malawi, the role that had been played, not just by Dr. David Livingstone in helping to bring an end to slavery back in the 19th century, but also the inspirational way in which his memory had been used to encourage thousands of Scots to go to Malawi to help develop and build the country. Not just the way in which Scotland supported Malawi at the time of the great debates on independence for so many African nations in the 1950s, and Scottish elected members were key to insisting that Malawi become an independent republic at the time of independence and not be gobbled up by neighbours in some other kind of state. And not only because there were professional organisations in education and in health in particular, who had developed really strong links with their partners in Malawi over the years. And there were already a lot of people-to-people exchanges and friendships. But critically, there was an organisation set up, as Andrew has just said, in 2004, coming out of the Malawi Millennium Project and developing this new Scotland Malawi Partnership, hosted by the University of Strathclyde with the support of the Province of Glasgow and Edinburgh, critically organised by the dedicated Peter West, that gave us an embryonic forum through which to channel the energy and the potential of this policy. So when we went into 2005 and we could see the G8 summit on the horizon, and we were engaged in and supporting the Make Poverty History campaign, and we were writing and then launching our international development policy, we pretty much knew that at that point, not only were we going to choose a country, but that we almost certainly had to choose Malawi. But that designation was cemented by the visit that I was able to undertake in May 2005. Welcomed, of course, by the President, Bingu Mutharika, but also welcomed by everybody that I met. It seemed when I was there that everybody knew about Scotland, that the connection went far beyond those who had a regular contact or who had visited. And in the various issues that I saw, people that I met when I was there, I think we could see just how important a partnership of mutual understanding and respect, mutual cooperation could be. And I learned an incredible amount from that visit, not only identifying problems that needed tackled immediately, going to Bottom Hospital, for example, which had been described as the worst maternity hospital in the world, where more babies were being born every year than there were in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, in one room with no fridge for medication, and with many of the women giving birth on the floor, but also the women and the children dying in the process. Not only in visiting a small village where children were learning from memory algebra and mathematics, because there was no chalk for the blackboard and there was no seats for them to sit on, and the school couldn't be used when it rained because the rain came through the straw roof. And yet there was a classroom just 20 yards away that had been partially built but couldn't be finished because nobody had been able to identify the £1,200 that was required to put a roof on that new classroom. But seeing other inspirational actions, young girls wanting to become nurses in a rural hospital who had not been vaccinated themselves, but were working in a ward full of people with infectious diseases because of their desire and ambition to build a better future for themselves and their families. Visiting schools and universities and colleges that were trying to make the best of old textbooks that had been handed down by those who didn't want them anymore, but were still managing to find a way of conducting education, passing examinations, pursuing learning, and trying to improve Malawi as a whole for the future. And all of these examples and all of these experiences, I became very convinced very quickly that there was something here that was important. It helped inform the debates around the G8 just a month later. But critically, it allowed the President and I to build on that old friendship, that old relationship. I had been slightly warned when I was preparing for the visit, maybe not to make quite too much about David Livingstone, because that was really from colonial times and it might be quite a sensitive subject. And I remember within hours of arriving, being told by the Malawians that I met that Dr. David Livingstone had not come from Scotland and discovered Malawi, but Malawi had discovered him. And that critical role that he had played in freeing the country from the tyranny of slavery and the trade had never been forgotten. And when the president came to Scotland in November that year, we went on a joint visit to the Livingstone Centre in Blantyre in Lanarkshire. And he had tears in his eyes as he looked at the exhibits in the museum, the shackles, the old pictures, the stories, the exhibits that told that story. Because he could remember his grandparents telling him about this man from Scotland who'd come and played this critical role. So we knew by the end of 2005 that we had something special. And we knew for one other reason too. When Peter West came to see me at the beginning of that year, he planned to make a bid for a small amount of money to help organise a conference in November that would bring together people in Scotland who were interested in Malawi, but maybe a few representatives from Malawi as well. I was strongly advised by my civil servants, not Andrew Gowdy, but others at that time, to be a bit hesitant about allocating this money to this new organisation. But instead, we decided to go in a very different direction. I proposed to Peter that the partnership should invite a number of people, a far higher number of people from Malawi to come over. If we were going to start off this partnership in true Scottish style, we needed to get everybody in the same room, do it in the Parliament, and get the partnership off on the right start. And that was what happened in November, as Andrew has described. And that conference, the visit of the President, the signing of the agreement, which the President, who was quite a formal man, I think the High Commissioner would agree, a lot of protocols and formalities around the President back then in 2005, when he told Malawians gathered in Scotland that this was not the Jack and Bingu show, but was about people-to-people cooperation and development, then I think we knew that we had something special on which we could build. And 15 years on, I want to congratulate everybody who's been involved in the partnership. The Scotland Malawi Partnership organisation itself these days has 1,200 members, individuals and organisations, half of Scotland's local authorities, all the universities, most of the colleges, 230 schools in formal membership, probably the same number again, involved in some way in partnership with Malawi, all sorts of churches and faith groups, and of course, many individual institutions within our health service in Scotland. And as Edinburgh University, as Andrew said, as Edinburgh University have calculated, the work of the partnership is estimated to benefit development in Malawi to the tune of about nearly £3 million a year, and in Scotland, even developing benefit in Scotland to the tune of over £250,000 a year. And in the number of individuals involved, in Malawi, over 200,000 individuals involved in some way in this partnership every year. In Scotland, over 100,000 involved each year too. These are phenomenal statistics for an organisation that doesn't spend an awful lot of money, that is ultimately all about the people. But maybe that's why it has been such a success. And I've been particularly pleased over the last few years to see the original vision of a similar partnership organisation in Malawi develop as well, the Malawi Scotland Partnership, with again hundreds of members and a really deep place in Malawi civic society, which I think was best shown by the recent joint conference of the Scotland Malawi Partnership and the Malawi Scotland Partnership, addressed by the new President of Malawi, who set out very clear challenges to the partnership to develop over the next few years. President Chakwera said he'd like to see the membership in Scotland rise to 1,500 from 1,200. He'd like to see 500,000 people involved, not just 300,000. He'd like to see a return to a big joint conference in Scotland, But crucially, he then focused on one issue that he felt could matter more than most, and that was the urgent issue of climate change. And he urged both the people of Scotland and the people of Malawi to work together as we plan for the climate change summit in Scotland next November, to ensure that the urgency of this issue is at the top of the political agenda, and that real actions are not just decided but actually acted upon. So this partnership that has seen 3 First Ministers, 4 Presidents of Malawi, in fact 9 Secretaries of State for the Department of International Development at the UK level, some of whom supported it more than others, has really, I think, today is now today in a position where it's making a real mark in both countries. And I think in recent years that development, I don't want to embarrass anybody here, but I think David Hope-Jones and the team at the Scotland Malawi Partnership done an absolutely incredible job, not just in building the organisation and supporting everybody involved, but crucially in getting the tone and the substance right as well. Scotland Malawi Partnership is about listening to Malawi. It is about proper mutual development, understanding what is required and needed, what is going on, and then responding to that. Listening, not lecturing. And it's a break from that donor-recipient relationship that plagues the world. No matter how much good overseas development assistance does and has done over the years, that relationship between countries of donor and recipient countries is a serious problem in many parts of the world. And we have managed between Scotland and Malawi to do something very different, and something that I hope others can learn from and build upon as we go through this 15th year. The other truth, though, unfortunately, is that Malawi is still poor. While this partnership has been, a remarkable success, and while inside Malawi there is hope, I think now, for reform and change that might make a real difference to the lives of Malawians, Malawi is still a country that is far from able to support the opportunity for its citizens to reach their full potential, to have safe, fulfilling, happy, content, well-fed lives. So there is much work to be done, and it's not just in Malawi. I think in 2020, we have seen exposed across the world some of the real weaknesses and fragilities that we perhaps thought were a feature of the past. We've seen a real impact of this COVID pandemic on the economy across the world, a 5.2% drop likely in global GDP in 2020. Estimates range, but it's possible that over 100 million people will drop into extreme poverty this year, the first rise in extreme poverty for decades. It's estimated that there could be 2 million additional child deaths as a result of the pandemic and the impact on health services around the world, the deflection away from programs of vaccination and programs to deal with malnutrition and so on. The number of days lost in schools is phenomenal. And even in September, a quarter of the world's countries still had their schools closed and didn't have a date to reopen. And while there are big challenges in the world of overseas development assistance, and the other areas that are now much more important for the development of national economies in the developing world, we see remittances, that money that is passed back to families in country from those who have gone to work abroad, down by 20% in 2020, and foreign direct investment estimated to be down by as much as 30 to 40%. In a world that we knew was increasingly interdependent, we have seen exposed this year a real lack of preparation globally and nationally a lack of resilience in governance, resilience in our school systems, resilience in our systems of international trade, a true lack of global resilience and national resilience to this kind of shock. So it's more than just a lack of preparation. It's a lack of foresight, a lack of future planning, a lack of sustainable development. And this is a lack of resilience that will come back to bite us again in the future, not just in pandemics, but in tackling climate change and living with the impact of climate change. And the next time there is a big financial shock, because undoubtedly one will come, we will not be prepared again unless we take action to build back better, or I think somebody said a few weeks ago, build forward better, to look to a different kind of international relationship, a different kind of international development as we move from 2020 into 2021 and beyond. And I would argue that there is already here a roadmap. Perhaps, as the Prime Minister might have said this time last year, an oven-ready roadmap that is available to us for this new kind of development, sustainable development across both the rich and the poorer parts of the world. Back in 2005, we were talking about the Millennium Development Goals, and they had been agreed in the year 2000. They were targeted on the year 2015. There had been very little progress around the world. The G8 Summit and the Make Poverty History campaign were about, particularly in Africa, changing that direction of travel, changing it so that we were able to speed up the rate of development and improve the provision in basic education, basic health, basic provision of clean water, and so on, to make an immediate impact on basic needs. But by the time that 2015 came along, it was very clear that the Millennium Development Goals had made a difference in some parts of the world. They had particularly made a difference in stable, peaceful, already developing but very poor countries. But they had made a negligible difference in countries that had multiple challenges, and particularly those that had fragile governments or were engaged in conflict and violence. So the Sustainable Development Goals had to be different. And in all the consultation that took place before 2015 in their agreement, there were huge debates about the level to which the SDGs could commit us globally to economic development, to improvements in infrastructure, to improvements in forms of consumption and trade, to tackling climate in all its impacts and the state of our environment and our biodiversity. And crucially, to the state of governance and the democratic institutions that are fundamental to the proper exercise of the rule of law, and to democracy and development and peace. And in agreeing the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals that give us an integrated, comprehensive framework for sustainable development in 2015, the world, the global community, the individual nations that were signing up to these goals were agreeing them alongside, critically, alongside the goals and targets that were being set in Paris towards the end of that year on climate, and a new framework for development cooperation and finance, including a recognition of the critical importance of national systems of public finance and foreign direct investment and the business environment. All of these are packaged together, offer a new hope. And I think it would be fair to say that as well as not preparing properly for a pandemic, not having the global resilience in place that could help us deal with the shocks to trade and to education and our economies far beyond the shock to our health services, the progress on the SDGs had been far too slow between 2015 and 2020. In setting out that roadmap for sustainable development, the SDGs deal with issues of governance. They deal with the economic development required to actually fund on a proper, permanent, long-term basis the public services that are required. They deal with the critical issues of inequality and discrimination that have held back development for too long. They strongly emphasize the need for resilience and sustainability in all of these developments. But they had two crucial principles at their core. One was that they were universal, that they affected everybody everywhere. And that's pretty much what you could say about COVID-19, affecting everybody everywhere. Secondly, they had a principle of leaving no one behind. And as we come out of this year, when the pandemic has had such an impact on so many aspects of lives across the whole world, then that principle of leave no one behind surely has to drive the sustainable development that we want to see from 2021 onwards, if there is to be a recovery that is meaningful for every part of the world and for every person, even within those parts of the world that are already fairly comfortably off. There was a commitment in September at the United Nations to a decade of action, which would work harder and faster towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2020. And that decade of action, to me, is absolutely crucial. It's not just crucial on climate, although that is, of course, fundamental to everything else. But it is, I think, a lesson to us as a result of the pandemic this year, that if we're going to face these kind of shocks again, if we do not improve our systems nationally and internationally over this next decade and create more sustainable societies, communities, and economies at the national and the local level, then the next time a shock like this hits us, it will be at least as devastating again. And I was really pleased to see in the brochure for the new centre here at Strathclyde, the fact that the university has been recognised by a high placing in impact rankings for universities in relation to 3 specific SDG goals. Particularly pleased by the ranking on goal 16, which is close to my heart as somebody who's involved in peace building and conflict prevention around the world. And I think the way in which the University of Strathclyde has tried to embody these goals in its own internal activity as a university in central Scotland is an indication of what is needed elsewhere. We've had I think, a stuttering response to this over the years from not just the UK government, but other levels of government in the UK as well. The UK was at the centre of the agreement of these goals in 2015. The Prime Minister, the Prime Minister Cameron, chaired the international group that prepared the goals for agreement. Secretary of State Justine Greening was right at the centre of their launch in 2015. But in the years afterwards, the government in Whitehall has struggled, I think, to realise the critical potential in the goals for the UK, not just for those other countries around the world where the UK is a partner. So all of the focus of the UK government on the goals over these past 5 years has been in relation to international development and those international partnerships. And almost none of the focus has been internal within the UK, using the goals for sustainable development here. Within the devolved nations, both Scotland and Wales I think have shown a willingness to maybe talk more about the goals and to put the references to the goals in national planning. But in both nations, I think we've yet to see concrete changes happen, real differences in the work of government that could be generated by these goals, and a strong commitment to leave no one behind. And at local government level, not just in Scotland, but across, I think, the English mayors and in the big cities and so on, I think there could have been significantly more commitment to using the Sustainable Development Goals to boost local sustainable development. With the most recent exception of Liverpool, which is in the news this week for other reasons, good cooperation with government on testing seems to be making a difference there. But Liverpool recently, this year, have embraced this concept of the decade of action and are willing to take action at the city level. So I think government in the UK, like governments all around the world, with a few exceptions, I think I've struggled to really get a grip of these goals and use them to drive change at home and in their global relationships. That's not necessarily been the case outside of government, particularly in the private sector. Really interestingly, I think across the finance sector in particular, but also in global manufacturing and in other areas, we see the goals increasingly being used by companies to drive their longer term strategic planning, and in some cases their target setting. And in Scotland, for example, Scottish and Southern Energy, headquartered in Perth, has included 3 of the goals in their executive remuneration targets. So those in charge of the company will not get their annual bonuses unless the company is contributing to the achievement of these key sustainable development goals. And I think the private sector, perhaps ironically, has been far ahead of the public sector in taking up the challenge of the goals and using the goals to set a new course for the way in which they do business sustainably for the longer term. So I want to conclude on 2 points. First of all, is there support for this kind of action? Well, as recently as the weekend, in opening the G20 summit, the UN Secretary General said, we need solidarity and cooperation, and we need concrete action now, especially for the most vulnerable. We must advance on 2 fronts. First, recovering in a way that is inclusive, bringing everyone along. And second, recovering in a way that is sustainable, meaning above all, stepped up climate action. He said we have the opportunity to not simply reset the world, but to transform it. And that is the opportunity that the decade of action gives us. And at the start of that decade in 2021, I think the UK has an incredible opportunity and a responsibility to lead that debate. The UK has recently merged its Foreign and Commonwealth Office and its Department for International Development, creating a new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office that is meant to embody the idea of a global Britain as we leave the European Union. It must surely be the case that that department should have at its heart the Sustainable Development Goals, this roadmap, this oven-ready roadmap to recovery in the 2020s. But it must also be the case that the SDGs are placed at the centre of government as well. And that means in the Cabinet Office, driving the government's agenda at home as well as abroad. If this government is serious about levelling up and helping those communities and individuals across the UK that have fallen behind, then the SDGs provide that roadmap at home as well as abroad. And the Chancellor was going to announce anything positive tomorrow, then it surely would be that the concept of leave no one behind and sustainable development would be at the heart of his spending plans next year and beyond, rather than cutting overseas development assistance. Secondly, the UK needs to make the most of its international leadership role next year. We referred to 2005 and the incredible leadership shown by Tony Blair and the UK government, and in many ways by the people of the UK for the G8 summit in Gleneagles in the summer of 2005, a moment when the political parties in the UK united for the first time in committing to the 0.7 of gross national income to be spent on overseas development assistance. And next year, not only do we have the G7 in the UK as a summit which the UK can lead, but we also have COP26 on climate in November in Glasgow and a number of other events too. And this is a huge opportunity, not just to lead the world on climate, but to lead the world on sustainable development as a whole. And these major international events and the build up to them should have the SDGs, the global goals at their core. But finally, I think as we did in 2005, I think the people of the UK can signal something more. This is not just about governments. The SDGs, the global goals, are universal. They are for everybody, not just for governments. And therefore, I think everybody has a responsibility in helping to deliver them. Just as everybody had a responsibility to pressure the G8 at Gleneagles in 2005 to make poverty history, just as hundreds of thousands of people in Scotland and Malawi have taken up that responsibility on a very personal level and worked together between these two nations over the last 15 years to build this incredible partnership. I think in 2021, the businesses, the public sector organisations, the academic and educational institutions, and so many others, the civic society organisations, and the individuals of the UK and beyond, I think need to show governments that they want and believe in sustainable development. They want a greater resilience in our economies and our communities, and they want to see change in the way we relate to each other across the world. If we have learned anything from 2020, it is that interdependence is not a word, it is a reality in the world that we share today. And therefore, if we're going to prepare for the challenge of the future together, at the same time as maximising the potential and of everybody and leaving no one behind, then sustainable development, the sustainable development goals have to become everybody's responsibility to deliver, and not just left to government to deliver on a whim. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, Jack. That was an immensely insightful and challenging set of thoughts. It's so important that you've placed this anniversary in that sort of perspective. Thank you so much. I'm delighted that Jack is very happy to take questions for a while. And I know that the lecture has stimulated many thoughts because we've received many questions already during the course of the lecture. And you're welcome to add more to the Zoom Q&A, please, if you'd like to. But I think we will be unable to get to them all, I'm afraid. I thought I'd start, Jack, with a nice easy one for you. Someone's asking, what are the positive lessons we can take from the global response to COVID-19? And how can we ensure we don't lose the sense of global citizenship we have achieved in this period?
Well, in some ways, the question answers itself. I think that feeling of we're all in this together, has been a positive in 2020. I think that has been challenged, not just in this country, but elsewhere in many other places too, by the way in which governments have sometimes conducted themselves. But I think we've seen at the individual level, and in many private and public institutions, a sense of commitment to the public good and to the community that maybe we all thought had been a bit lacking over recent times. While we might see the rises of populism and nationalism around the world embodied in the election of controversial figures in different places, and challenges to the established way of doing things because of people's resentment or fears about globalization. I think we have seen this year a greater level of understanding in populations that global concerns can be very immediate in your own local community, that things that happen in other parts of the world have an impact in our own places too. How do we build on that? I think we need leadership to build on that. You can do so much, I think, as individuals and as communities, but I think leaders need to understand the potential for a whole new set of personal relationships and personal responsibilities. I hope that we can move on from a rules-based system of dealing with COVID and pandemics to a system that's based more on personal responsibilities. I hope we can learn something about consumption and production, with more locally based production in the future in every part of the world, but also particularly in what I might describe as our world, less consumption. I think we've learned a lot about that, things that we can live without, frankly, this year. And I hope we can also perhaps learn something that certainly in this country's got a bit lost, and that is that we need to live healthier lives. So, I mean, I think a lot of this, I think, is about the way that we as individuals live our lives and the signals that we get from governments about what's important. And I hope that we don't see a mad rush back to commercialization and waste, and actually using not just the language of sustainable development, but trying to create communities based around sustainable development in the developed world as well as in other parts of the world as well. You're on mute, Andrew.
Thanks, Jack. There's many very good questions. There's one here in the box, which I think is particularly important. The question says, it feels as if the SDGs have taken a back seat during the COVID crisis, and what you've discussed speaks directly to many goals. How do we get these back on the agenda, and what are the hurdles that we need to overcome?
Well, I think to me, the biggest hurdle is short-term thinking in governments around the world. The governments that have taken these goals most seriously and have made the most progress and changed the way they operate as a result are the governments that are thinking most long-term. And that's true in every continent. The best examples of implementing and delivering the goals are in places where governments are thinking longer term. Where governments are thinking short term, whether it's immediate political advantage or immediate giveaways to the population to make people feel better and make them more popular, then that is where the goals are making the least difference and have the least impact. So we need to try and change the thinking in governments to be more longer term and less short term. While I do agree that COVID has taken attention away from the goals, I think we were already in trouble on that anyway. These goals have not had the sort of public recognition around the world that we would have wanted them to have. That was a problem for the Millennium Development Goals back in 2000 to 2005 as well. To some extent, the G8 Summit and the Global Make Poverty History campaign in 2005 helped change that. And I think we need to find ways in 2021 to create the sort of international debate that then permeates through to individual citizens. Because I think ultimately, for real action on the goals, for real delivery of these goals, we need citizens to be holding their governments to account. So popularising the goals and engaging citizens around the world in the promotion of the goals and demanding answers from their elected politicians is the one way that will see the most progress made. And anything we can do to achieve that will be work well carried out.
Thanks, Jack. There's a couple here about, more specifically about Malawi, but with a broader application too. You talk about the poverty of Malawi and elsewhere and the challenges in meeting the needs of the most vulnerable in the world. What changes of mindset in funding and strategy are needed to ensure that we accelerate help for the most vulnerable as a priority? How do we really leave no one behind?
Well, I think it's very difficult to avoid leaving people behind if you have poor governance and you don't have an effective system of democracy and the rule of law that is inclusive with institutions that people can trust. So I put goal 16 very high up the agenda. And but I have to say, what has happened in Malawi this year, with institutions standing firm for democracy and the constitution, is a good sign, and something on which I think people in Malawi can build. I hesitate to put too much pressure on the incoming new president and vice president, but I wish them well, and I hope that we'll see real progress even in these really, really difficult times. I think that's important, but I also think that we need to give a much stronger focus in all of our discourse on this to the building of national economies. I think there is still a mindset across far too much of the developed world, of the donor countries, for want of a better description, and to some extent the international organizations, to focus on doing things for people rather than helping countries and communities to sustainably develop themselves. And in the longer term, the thing that will make the biggest difference, in addition to good governance and inclusive governance, inclusive institutions, the thing that will make the biggest difference will be strong national economies that themselves are sustainable, that are not relying on handouts from anywhere else. And that means investing in the growth of the private sector. It means creating a business environment in which local entrepreneurs can flourish. It means creating safe and secure and well-paid jobs that can support families, but also lead to greater commercial activity within country. And critically, it means securing safe trade routes, good, fair trade routes between countries as well. And I've been very clear on this in the House of Lords. We need in this country, as we agree all these new trade agreements around the world following Brexit, we need to have in mind the fact that we have a historic responsibility here for justice to ensure that some of those countries that we exploited so much in previous centuries have the access to trade that will allow them themselves to produce, expand, and export more in the years to come.
Thanks, Jack. I've got a couple of questions here which focus particularly on what we can learn from Malawi. We both stressed this point when we were speaking earlier. And the first one says, The Economist magazine wrote in the summer that during COVID this year, some countries have seen a decline in the strength of democracy and citizens' rights. One country has seen strengthened democracy, Malawi. How can the rest of us learn from Malawi's people's remarkable achievement?
Well, there are times in the past year when I have been saluting Malawi's democracy and despairing at ours. So that is certainly a lesson that we can be taken seriously. One of the things that was said to me on that first trip in 2005, first official trip in 2005, by a consultant from Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, who was working in the hospital in the Lilongwe, has stayed with me ever since. He said that, he had gone there essentially to volunteer for a period of months, and was dealing with a very different health service and health challenges than he would have been dealing with back in Edinburgh, with all the equipment and facilities and staff that he would have had there. But he actually, interestingly, he said he learned more in those few months in Malawi about treating certain conditions and about being a consultant than he'd learned ever since he was a student. And I was really taken by that far too often in the past, people from, again, if I can use these terms, I know that we can use different terms, but let's just use them for the sake of illustration. People from the developed world have gone to the developing world to help and seen it only as a one-way trip, where they are helping people who need help rather than learning anything in return. And I think one of the things that we learned very early on in the partnership, and I think has embodied the Scotland Malawi Partnership ever since, has been that there is that mutual support provides mutual benefits, that we can all learn from each other. This is not just a one-way street. And I think that has been a really important factor in the development of the Scotland-Malawi relationship. And I am absolutely certain that there will be things going on in Malawi today and over the coming years, partly in response to what has happened with COVID and the closure of schools, where technology will be used to educate those who are not able to go to school or who are living in remote locations or who've fallen behind in a way that could be done in Scotland and isn't yet being done. And I think there will be things that we can learn from the system in Malawi that have not yet been learned in Scotland. So I am certain there's always a potential for mutual learning. And I hope that is going to continue as the partnership moves forward.
Thanks, Jack. There's a couple of questions here about universities, which will probably come as no surprise given where you are today. The first one is, I'll paraphrase, is that there are obviously a lot of links between Scottish and Malawian universities. Where do you see the future of these partnerships in strengthening research capacity in Malawi itself, in Malawian research institutions, to help that in Malawi? And the second, partly related, but partly different question, which I'll give you at the same time, is what role can you see universities playing in meeting the SDGs? What more can we expect of universities?
Well, I think I do. I don't know what the situation is like in reality in Strathclyde. I haven't inspected your performance against these grand statements in the brochure of the centre. But on the face of it, I think Strathclyde has understood the importance of the SDGs and sustainable development and its role in that ecosystem. And I think it's very important that all universities understand that as well, not just in relation to the nature of its research and not just in its international partnerships, but in the way that you conduct business internally, the priorities you have, the example that you set. And so I'd like all UK higher and further educational institutions to be working harder on that. I think the other thing that universities do, because this is part of their key role, is that universities teach and train and develop the future leaders of our public sector, our private sector, our main civic institutions and government. And therefore, again, I think that example can create a culture amongst those who are leaving university that they can take into the professional and other lives that they will have afterwards. And that is an important role for universities as well, one that's maybe not recognised often enough out with the university sector. So I think these things are important. How can universities in Scotland develop their relationships with Malawi? What we need to do here is recognise the critical importance of a stronger, more sustainable higher education system in Malawi itself, and similarly a stronger, more sustainable further education sector. I think I've been disappointed for quite some time. On this, there was a really good project partnership underway between the Scottish colleges and the colleges in Malawi back a decade ago that was kind of cut off in its prime when I think they were turned down for a government grant at one point, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I think that was a big mistake. I think the development of partnerships between our higher and further education institutions and those institutions in Malawi that can help the institutions in Malawi learn from our experience, develop their capacity and the skills, and ultimately, in Malawi, not here, but in Malawi, be conducting the sort of high quality research and development that is expected elsewhere. I think will make a big difference to the country. The school system in Malawi is absolutely critical, and it's fundamental that more young people complete secondary school, that they do so on time, that the standards of teaching, the access to the curriculum and learning across the country in the rural areas in particular be expanded. But you then need to have that further and higher education sector that can complete at least the initial stages of vocational training in the colleges and can critically conduct not just teaching but research as well that is in country and that is suitable and appropriate and useful for Malawi and Malawians. And that needs time, it needs investment, but I think it can also be helped by strong partnerships, and Scottish universities are ideally placed to do that, given their incredible international history.
Thanks, Jack. I should tell you there's lots of appreciative thanks in the chat box to you for your lecture and for your questions, but that doesn't mean they're asking easy questions of you, I'm afraid. Here's one which is perhaps unsurprising at the moment, given what's been going on. We have seen the merger of DFID and the FCO, the threat to reduce the 0.7 to 0.5 tomorrow, and the diversion of aid to non-development purposes. Sorry, I've just lost the rest of the question. Just disappeared off my screen for some reason. I think the rest of the question was basically what could be done to stem this insidious drift in UK thinking.
Well, I think obviously thinking a lot about that over the last few days. I should probably say, first of all, that although I've always been a supporter of overseas development assistance and increases in UK assistance, and part of that was the figure of 0.7%, less than a penny in every £100 less than a penny of every pound of UK GNI. I was never absolutely convinced that there was a necessity to put that into legislation until I watched the way that the debate was developing as the budget increased, because the debate around the amount consistently became more strident and noisy than the debate about what we were spending the money on. So when the proposal came to Parliament in 2014, 2015 to write the 0.7% into legislation, I supported that wholeheartedly. And my justification for doing that at that stage and making it so specific was that it would allow us then to go on and debate more properly what we were spending the money on, what the priorities were, what the style of development should be, the partnerships we were creating. And at that time, I was also very conscious we were about to agree the Sustainable Development Goals, and therefore the debate could perhaps move on to the delivery of the goals. And there are times in the last 5 years when that has definitely been the case, where the debate has been about where the money is going rather than how much money is being spent. We are in great danger in the next 24 hours of reopening that debate again, taking our eye completely off the ball on priorities, global cooperation, the need to make the most of our ODA, and to use it wisely and as an investment for the future, and to get back to a polarised debate about the overall amount. It is a cavalier action that is all the more cavalier because the one absolute promise on this in the manifesto of the Conservative Party this time last year was not to reduce this 0.7 commitment. So if it is going to be announced tomorrow, and it's still at least a little bit of an if, then I think it's going to do great damage to Britain's reputation, but also I think it does great damage to the purpose of government in this country, and a recognition that everything we've seen this year, not just in COVID, but in climate and so on as well, that proves how interdependent our world is, has been just dismissed at the end of the year by a government. I think if they are going to do it, possibly just trying to pick a fight. And I think that would be a great shame. I think the way to respond to this is not to turn to figures from the past, like me, and many of the others who've spoken out over the last few days, and not necessarily to turn to those organisations that have spent a lot of that ODA over the years, because I think they are sometimes seen, and sometimes rightly seen, as having a vested interest in the overall amount. The only way to challenge this and challenge it properly is through people power. And we need to get back to a situation where aid, the commitment to aid, the culture in this country of understanding the justice and the importance as an investment for the future of our overseas aid, is for people at a local level, at community level, to stand up and demand that of their elected representatives. I hope that across the UK, that reaction will be local, it will be focused, that people will be reminded what they have promised, and that ultimately we can challenge this decision if it has indeed been made. If it is going to be made, I am extremely disappointed. I think there's been real cross-party agreement on this. Michael Howard changed the Conservative Party's position on it in June 2005 at the time of the Make Poverty History campaign, and it has stayed a consistent cross-party commitment ever since. And those who change that, I hope, will do so at their own peril and not at the peril of the poorest in the world.
Thanks, sir. I think just squeeze one last one, if we may, Jack. Very much a Malawian question, but obviously true of many countries. There have been several questions about business models and trying to improve trade between Malawi and the rest of the world. And this particular one, let me offer to you. What is your opinion on how we should be promoting value-added products from Malawi that give much needed income at the start of the supply chain? For example, in relation to the Mzuzu coffee farmers and their roasted in-country coffee.
I thought we might get a question about Mzuzu coffee, and delighted that to strongly endorse the product. I think we've seen two things. I think in this year in relation to trade. First of all, the critical importance of sustainable national economies and the benefits of particularly poorer countries in the world not having to rely on imports and subsidies for produce that's vital locally. So that is critically important inside Malawi and other countries, but also access to trade. There were countries and businesses within countries that will have been close to bankruptcy this year, but as trade routes closed down at the beginning of the lockdowns back in the spring. And I think there's a key role here in the World Trade Organization discussions that will now be led for the first time by somebody from sub-Saharan Africa, after the appointment of the new leader of WTO, the former finance minister of Nigeria. She knows at first hand the critical importance of these trade routes And I think it will be vital that global trade negotiations are not just the preserve of those countries that trade the most, not just the preserve of those who exploit trade routes the most, but that they open up access on a sustainable way for those who are trying to build economies and build businesses and provide products that have added value in country. And I hope that any negotiations that take place in the years to come have that much more front and centre than they've had in the past. And I believe actually the experience of the COVID pandemic will demand that. I think one of the reasons that she has been chosen by the members of the World Trade Organization is probably because of that experience this year, when the issue of trade became so critically important for national economies and businesses back in April and May.
Thank you, Jack. I'm afraid we should draw this part to a halt now, but thank you very much for the thoughtfulness and openness with which you responded to a range of excellent questions, and apologies, of course, to those whose questions we haven't been able to fit in. I'm now delighted to be able to turn to His Excellency Kena Maponda, Malawi High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, who would like to offer an expression of thanks. Let me briefly introduce him to those who may not know him well. The High Commissioner is a career diplomat appointed to the UK in March 2015. He is indeed a very busy commissioner, and the High Commissioner is accredited not only to the UK, but also to Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Ireland, Malta, Norway, Portugal, Spain, and Sweden. A good long list there. The High Commissioner has had a very distinguished career representing Malawi in Washington, New York, and Germany prior to coming to London, and has worked at the top of the Malawi government in all the key ministries for many years too. Above all, he is a great friend of Scotland and has offered valuable support to the intensification and further development of our relationship throughout his tenure. We are delighted to have you this afternoon, Kena, and may I invite you to say a few words, please. Thank you very much.
Right Honourable Lord McConnell, Professor Andrew Gold, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure and honour for me, and indeed all participants and guests, making this event as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Scotland Malawi Partnership. It is an epoch-making event. I wish to express my most sincere thanks and gratitude for the inspiring, insightful, and thought-provoking lecture delivered by Right Honourable Lord McConnell of Glens Collardale, entitled "Leave No One Behind, a Roadmap to Build Back Better." Such eloquence and brilliance on the subject are clear testimony of how Lord McConnell has become a solid pillar in the relations between Malawi and Scotland. Equally beneficial and enlightening was the question and answer session, and Lord McConnell very ably answered the questions in a very systematic manner. As we're all aware, and indeed this has been mentioned a couple of times, Lord McConnell signed the cooperation agreement between Malawi and Scotland in the year 2005. He has had a lot of interest in development in Malawi, one aspect of which, if I may remind you, in one of your visits, Lord McConnell, to Malawi, that's 5 years ago, you fell in a dark street. You thereafter tweeted, spent the evening discussing the importance of better electricity for Malawi, walked out to the dark street and fell down a drain. Ouch, I end up there. I thought I could take this opportunity to inform you, Lord McConnell, that the situation relating to electricity, your interest, has really tremendously improved. And I eagerly look forward to your next visit to the warm heart of Africa. It is also important to reflect on your lecture, especially in the context of challenges and how we can all play a part in this noble task. For the simple reason of bringing the past to the fore, allow me to recap on the relations between the UK and Malawi, which go back to the colonial times in general. This started with the creation of the British Central Africa Protectorate in 1893, And the relations between Malawi and Scotland have also had their genesis in the missionary aspect relating to David Livingstone, visiting Nyasaland more than 150 years ago as one of the pioneers. I don't want to get into the other aspect. I remember you did mention Lord McConnell about the discoveries and all that. The roots of the protectorate started indeed with David Livingstone, no question about it. This is a history which I believe everybody knows, but it doesn't do any harm to repeatedly put on record, given its significance and symbolism. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, we are not makers of history. We are made by history. Today brings another aspect to the history as it replicates itself in the 25th anniversary of the Scotland Malawi Partnership. Today, giving numbers which I think everybody knows now, and I think Lord McConnell did mention this, more than 208,000 Malawians and 109,000 Scots are actively involved in community-led partnerships between our two nations. 46% of Scots, almost half the country, can name a friend or family member with a connection to Malawi, making this one of the world's strongest north-south people-to-people links. Let me also reiterate or emphasize one of the issues that His Excellency Dr. Lazarus Chakwera, President of the Republic of Malawi, fervently made on the 24th of September 2020 during the annual general meeting of the partnership. And this is an issue that Lord McConnell also mentioned. He would want to see the scaling up of the partnership from 1,200 bilateral civic links to 1,500, and to increase the total number of Scots and Malawians involved from 300,000 to 1 million, to 500,000 rather. This goal is a surmountable task among the varied issues which this grouping can enhance and also governize. In conclusion, let me humbly thank Lord McConnell once again for this wonderful lecture. Professor Andrew Goody for meticulously and ably organizing this event, not to forgetting Fiona and Tracy, and also thank the University of Strathclyde for the same. University of Strathclyde has had a long relationship with Malawi. Last but not least, I thought I would show a bit of my Scottish, which says, Lang Mayo Lamrik. I'll say that again, Lang Mayo Lamrik. The translation is, long may your chimney smoke. The meaning being, may you live a long life of prosperity. In essence, I wish Lord McConnell, the Scotland Malawi Partnership, and the relations between Malawi and Scotland long life. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Many thanks indeed, High Commissioner, for your thoughtful words, and I'm sure you echo the thoughts of us all this afternoon. So let me bring this anniversary to a close. Thank you all for attending, and I'm sorry, of course, that we couldn't meet in person. Thank you to some of those who've done the hard work behind the scenes as usual, especially Tracy Morse, the head of the new Centre for Sustainable Development, and Fiona Doyle, Fiona Lynn, and our technical man, Alan McLeave, upon whom we depend hugely. And finally, a big thank you to the High Commissioner, of course, and also especially to Lord McConnell for providing a really valuable and thoughtful lecture. It's hugely appreciated and a very appropriate way in which to celebrate this anniversary. So thank you all and goodbye.